The Tvar Dominion had never known defeat. Never feared an enemy. Never ran from a battle. But then, they made a mistake. They angered humanity. And in that moment, for the first time in their blood-stained history, the Tvar finally understood what it meant to be prey. The first explosion turned the skyline into fire. The second split the ground beneath Elias Vance's feet. The Zenith Accord's emergency broadcast cut through the city's calms in a sterile, monotone voice. Do not engage. Evacuate. All hostilities will be resolved diplomatically. Remain calm. Elias sprinted down the ruined street, the once pristine glass towers of New Terra's capital collapsing around him. Smoke and panic filled the air. Civilians ran in every direction, searching for an escape. There was none. Above, the Tvar fleet hovered like a black storm, their warships unnatural, jagged things that seemed to pulse with hunger. A woman clutched her child beside the shattered remains of an AI assistance drone, begging it for help. The drone repeated the same useless message. Diplomatic resolution in progress. Remain calm. Elias grabbed them, pushing them toward the nearest transport hub. Move. Now. The sky tore apart as another plasma barrage slammed into the city. Buildings folded like paper, bodies vaporized in the inferno. The Accord's AI defense grid did nothing. Elias's comm implant crackled. Elias! Celine's voice, desperate, full of static. Marcus and I, we're in the residential sector. The emergency exits are locked. Stay there. I'm coming. He pushed through the chaos, his pulse pounding. The Tvar drop pods speared into the streets, monstrous black cylinders that hit the ground like meteors. They hissed open, revealing 8-foot-tall nightmares, Tvar's shock troops, covered in plated armor that shifted like living obsidian. They moved fast. The first warrior grabbed a screaming man, tore him in half like cloth, and tossed the remains aside. A mother ran, carrying her child, a plasma round punched through both. Elias reached for his sidearm. He had no rifle, no armor, just a diplomat's sidearm, meant for ceremonial duty. The Tvar warrior turned, yellow slits for eyes locking onto him. A voice crackled over the Tvar comms. The humans do not fight. The Accord has made them weak. Kill them at your leisure. The warrior lunged. Elias fired first. The shot did nothing against the warrior's armor. The Tvar grabbed him by the throat, hoisted him into the air, and slammed him against a burning transport wreck. A deep, clicking laugh. A human! You have forgotten your rage. Elias gasped for breath. Go to hell. He yanked a shrapnel shard from the wreckage and drove it into the warrior's eye socket. The Tvar screamed, a high, alien shriek, dropping Elias as it staggered back, clawing at the wound. Elias grabbed a fallen shock rifle, twisted mid-roll, and emptied the magazine into the warrior's head. Bone and chitin exploded in a fine mist. He didn't stop to think. He ran. His family was waiting. Another impact shook the ground. The high-speed rail collapsed in a twisted scream of metal. The residential district was burning. The Tvar had already reached it. Celine's voice was gone. Elias sprinted through the rubble, lungs burning. He saw the ruins of his home, half buried under fallen steel. His mind screamed at him to move faster, to dig through the wreckage too. He saw a small hand sticking out from beneath the rubble. A hand he knew. His vision narrowed. A Tvar execution squad stood over the remains, scanning for survivors. One of them tilted its head, mandibles clicking. You call yourselves warriors? Elias's world went red. He barely remembered raising the rifle. Only the sound of screaming, his own, theirs, the city dying around them. He was faster than them. More precise. The first warrior turned. Elias put 3 rounds into its throat. The second raised its weapon. Elias slammed the barrel of his rifle into its gut, fired through it, and hit the third. The last tried to run. Elias caught it. Broke its leg with one shot. It fell, snarling, blood leaking from its wounds. You are not supposed to fight like this. You are docile. Weak. Elias's voice was cold as death. Not anymore. The last shot turned its skull into mist. Elias knelt beside the rubble, shaking hands trying to move the debris. But he already knew. Marcus was gone. Celine was gone. Everything was gone. A shadow passed overhead. The Tvar High Marshal's personal cruiser descended from the clouds, its massive form blocking out the firelit sky. The Accord's AI transmitted one final message. Diplomatic negotiations unsuccessful. Please remain calm. Elias stood, blood and ash covering his face. He looked up at the warship. His fingers curled around the Tvar's own rifle. Negotiations over. He fired into the sky. And that's when the hunt began. The Tvar had expected submission. Compliance. A civilization that had spent centuries without war, softened by peace, shackled by logic. What they did not expect was Elias Vance. What they did not understand was what they had just awakened. His breath came in ragged gasps, his grip tightening around the rifle he had stolen from the corpses of the execution squad. His family was dead. His world was gone. And the Zenith Accord, the fragile utopia that had promised peace, had done nothing. A transmission crackled over the Tvar comms. New Terra is secured. Minimal resistance. The humans have lost their fire. The Accord is broken. This world is ours. Elias wiped blood from his mouth and exhaled slowly. No. This world was not theirs. He crouched low behind the wreckage, scanning the city's remains. Pockets of civilians still ran for their lives, some trying to hide, others breaking down in panic. The Tvar were systematic in their slaughter, eliminating survivors like vermin, culling the weak. A group of warriors marched past, one dragging a wounded human by the arm. The man's leg was mangled, his breath shuddering. He looked up, pleading. The Tvar's mandibles clicked. You should be grateful. Your suffering ends today. Elias raised the rifle. One shot, precise, controlled, efficient. The warrior's head snapped back as the plasma bolt ripped through its skull. The other spun around, scanning the darkness. Elias was already moving. He fired again, a clean hit through another Tvar's throat. Its shriek cut off as it collapsed, choking on its own blood. The last three opened fire in his direction. Elias ducked behind cover, counted their shots, waited for the pattern, then rose, sight locked, pulled the trigger. 3 bodies hit the ground. The wounded human gasped, eyes wide. Elias grabbed him, pulling him to his feet. Can you walk? The man grimaced, nodding. Who the hell are you? Someone who's tired of running. He handed the man a sidearm from one of the dead invaders. Find others. Arm them. No one gets taken alive. The man hesitated. The Accord said. Elias's voice cut through him like a blade. The Accord is dead. We fight now. The Tvar were already reacting. The comms buzzed with growing concern. There is an active resistance. Uncoordinated but spreading. A single unit is engaging and eliminating squads with extreme efficiency. The response came from the High Marshal himself, his voice dripping with amusement. Ah. So they remember. Good. Let them fight. They will die screaming. Elias crouched in the shadows of the burning city, reloading his weapon. The Tvar thought this was still a conquest. They didn't understand. This wasn't a war anymore. This was a hunt. He spotted a patrol team moving through the ruins, scanning the area where the last squad had fallen. 5 of them. He could take 2 before they reacted, maybe 3 if he was fast enough. Instead, he picked up a loose chunk of debris and hurled it into a side alley. The impact echoed. The Tvar immediately turned toward the sound, moving into the open. Elias rose behind them. 2 shots, 2 down. The third turned. Elias drove his elbow into its throat, snatched its sidearm, and emptied it into the last 2. The last warrior stumbled, clutching at its wounds, mandibles clicking in confusion. This is impossible. You are nothing. Elias stepped forward, pressed the barrel to its head, and pulled the trigger. Another broadcast flickered across Tvar comms. Additional units lost. Enemy tactics, unorthodox, unexpected. The High Marshal's amusement had vanished. Define unexpected. A pause. Then, a Tvar officer, voice uneasy. They are fighting, like us. The realization bled through the silence. Elias stole a fresh rifle from one of the fallen, slinging it over his shoulder. The resistance was growing. He could hear the distant echoes of gunfire that wasn't Tvar. Others had taken up arms. Good. The High Marshal's voice returned, sharp and irritated. Deploy the suppression squads. Burn the city if you must. End this nonsense. Now. Elias grinned. They thought this was nonsense? They still didn't understand. He clicked into the open Tvarcom frequency, letting them hear his voice for the first time. You came here thinking we were weak. That we had forgotten war. That we would kneel. Silence. The entire Tvar battalion listening. Elias stepped over the corpses of the warriors he had just slaughtered. His grip on the rifle tightened. His voice was low. Steady. But you made a mistake. You should have wiped us out in one strike. Because now we remember. He heard the first note of hesitation in their comms. And he smiled. They were finally starting to understand. This was no longer an invasion. This was a reckoning. The Tvar had always believed that war was a matter of overwhelming force. A simple calculation. A superior species would dominate an inferior one, and the cycle would continue. They had done it countless times across the stars, breaking civilizations, crushing resistance before it could ever begin. But the humans were different. Elias moved through the shattered remains of new terrace streets, his rifle hot in his hands, his breath steady. The enemy was adjusting. He could hear them coordinating over their comms, spreading out, sweeping the ruins, learning his patterns. Good. Let them adapt. It wouldn't matter. The broadcast reached him through a hijacked Tvar frequency. Target identified. Human male. Prioritizing elimination. Engage at full force. No mercy. Elias smirked. No mercy? Finally, they were speaking his language. The ground trembled as a suppression team advanced through the wreckage, their armor bulkier, their weapons heavier. 6 of them. They moved with the efficiency of executioners, covering angles, stepping over their fallen. Their leader's mandibles clicked as he scanned the area, his voice a growl. We know you're here, human. We've watched your kind die across 1,000 worlds. This ends the same way. Elias let them get closer. Let them feel like they were in control. He counted the seconds, felt the moment, and then. The grenade hit their formation before they could react. The explosion tore through the squad, ripping 2 apart immediately. A third staggered, armor cracked, and Elias was already moving, his rifle raised. 3 shots, 3 more down. The leader roared, swinging a plasma blade, but Elias sidestepped, bringing his rifle up like a club, smashing it against the warrior's head. Armor splintered. Blood sprayed. The Tvar stumbled, and Elias drove his knife into the gap beneath its throat, twisting hard. The warrior gurgled, slumping forward. Same way? Elias hissed, pulling the blade free. Not this time. The Tvar fleet had been monitoring everything. The High Marshal's voice cut through the comms, sharp, irritated. This is unacceptable. Deploy the war beasts. Erase this infestation. The war beasts. Elias had read about them in intercepted data, the Tvar's shock units, creatures engineered for destruction, massive, relentless, unstoppable. They were usually reserved for planetary conquest, meant to break entire armies. And they were about to be sent after one man. The first impact was like thunder, shaking the ground beneath him. Then another. The wreckage around him shattered as something enormous landed nearby. Elias looked up. The war beast loomed over him, standing almost twice his height, its plated hide thick as a battleship hull. Yellow eyes locked onto him, unblinking. Its breath was slow, controlled. Calculating. Elias exhaled. All right. Let's see what you've got. The beast charged, and Elias barely threw himself aside as the impact obliterated the structure behind him. He hit the ground, rolling to his feet as the warbeast turned, its mouth opening to reveal rows of serrated fangs. Elias fired. The rounds pinged harmlessly off its hide. The warbeast lunged, claws swiping. Elias dodged left, but the second strike came too fast, claws raking across his side, armor splitting, blood spilling. Pain flared, but he gritted his teeth. Not done. Not yet. He spotted a power conduit sparking near the wreckage. High voltage. Unstable. Deadly. He backed up, breathing hard. Baiting it. Come on. You're supposed to be unstoppable, right? The warbeast roared and charged again. Elias moved at the last second, pivoting past its massive bulk, guiding its momentum straight into the conduit. The shock hit instantly. A surge of raw energy arced through the beast, electricity crackling through its body. It spasmed violently, shrieking as its own strength betrayed it. The ground shook as the warbeast collapsed, smoke rising from its twitching form. Elias exhaled, wiping blood from his face. Guess not. Silence over the Tvar comms. Then a new voice, one he hadn't heard before, colder, more deliberate. The High Marshal himself. You should not exist. Elias scoffed, checking his rifle's charge. And yet here we are. You are alone, human. You fight like an animal. But no animal wins against the storm. Elias looked up. The Tvar fleet was repositioning. Shuttles deploying more forces. Surrender, and you may still be allowed to die with honor. Elias smirked, tightening his grip on his weapon. Honor's overrated. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Accord had fallen silent. They had tried diplomacy. They had tried containment. Now, they only watched in stunned horror. The Tvar, undefeated in 1,000 wars, were losing ground. Not to an army. Not to a planetary defense force. To one man. Elias Vance's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it without hesitation, rolling into the cover of a broken transport before the next barrage hit. Plasma fire chewed through metal, sending molten fragments into the air. He reached for another weapon, one stripped from a fallen Tvar, heavier, with a deep hum of lethal energy. He's still moving. The voice came from the enemy's open comms. They thought he was dead. Again. He smiled as he took aim. The shot burned through the first warrior's skull before the others could react. The second barely turned before Elias closed the distance, slamming his blade between the armor plates at its throat. It gurgled, clawing at him as he twisted the knife. The last one hesitated, mandibles clicking in confusion. Humans weren't supposed to fight like this. They were supposed to break. Elias saw the moment it realized. It was afraid. He let it run. Let it spread the fear. A new transmission cut across all frequencies. The High Marshal's voice was no longer amused. It was cold. Controlled. Deploy the Purge Protocol. The sky turned dark. Elias looked up as the Tvar fleet moved into formation. Orbital bombardment. The kind that didn't leave survivors. They had finally stopped underestimating him. Good. He clicked into the Accord's emergency channel. He wasn't sure if anyone was still listening. If anyone was even left. New Terra is lost. Evacuate whoever you can. Static. Then a weak voice. What about you? Elias watched the first wave of planet killers descend. I'm already dead. The ground erupted. Buildings turned to fire and ash. The shockwave threw Elias backward, heat searing his skin. He hit the ground hard, rolling until he slammed into debris. Pain screamed through his body, but he pushed himself up. Not yet. More landers were descending, deploying the Tvar's final wave. Elites. Warlords. The best they had left. They thought they were ending a battle. Elias was just getting started. He moved before they could form up, firing into their ranks as he ran straight into them. The first warrior took the brunt of his charge, knocked off balance just long enough for Elias to shove a detonation charge into its armor and kick it back. The explosion tore through the squad. The survivors turned on him, but he was already in their ranks. Close quarters. Where they weren't ready for him. A blade slashed toward him, he caught the wrist, twisted, snapped it in one motion. He stole the enemy's weapon, buried it into another's throat, then ripped it free just in time to parry a strike from behind. Pain flared in his side as a plasma round grazed him. He ignored it, dropped low, swept the legs from his attacker, and crushed its skull under his boot. The ground shook again. He barely moved in time as a massive figure slammed down from above. The last warlord. Towering, covered in armor thick enough to withstand orbital debris, carrying a blade that could cut through a tank. Elias spat blood. Finally! A challenge! The warlord lunged. Faster than something that size had any right to be. Elias barely dodged, rolling away as the blade carved a crater into the ground where he'd just been standing. He fired point blank. The shots did nothing. The warlord laughed, the deep rumble echoing like a death knell. Your struggle amuses me, human. You cannot win. Elias exhaled, flexing his fingers. He was out of ammo. Out of time. But he wasn't done. You first. He charged. The warlord swung again. Elias ducked under the massive blade, closing the distance, driving his shoulder into the enemy's center mass. The impact was like hitting a mountain, but the warlord stumbled. Elias took his chance. He grabbed the warrior's belt, the one holding its thermal grenades, ripped it free, armed them, and jammed the entire thing under its armor plating. The warlord's eyes widened. Elias grinned. Boom! He shoved off, diving away as the grenades detonated. The warlord's armor splintered from the inside out, molten fragments ripping through its body. It hit the ground, already dead. Elias rolled onto his back, breathing hard. The fleet still loomed overhead. More forces would come. They would keep coming until there was nothing left. But they had learned something today. They had learned what happened when humans got angry. The Accord's emergency channel crackled again. Elias! There's an extraction point. You need to move. He closed his eyes for just a second. Long enough to remember. Then he got up. Because the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The extraction point was 3 clicks north, beyond the wreckage of what had once been New Terra's central command. Elias moved like a ghost through the ruins, his body screaming at him to stop, his mind forcing him forward. Blood dripped from his side, soaking into the remains of his shattered armor. Every breath felt like fire. The Tvar were closing in. He could hear them moving through the wreckage, their voices sharp, tense. No more arrogance. No more casual slaughter. They were hunting him now. But Elias wasn't prey. A Tvar squad passed below, sweeping the ruins with their sensors. One of them paused, mandibles clicking, sniffing the air. He is close. Elias dropped from above. His knife found the first warrior's throat before it could react. The others turned, raising their rifles, but he was already moving. He rolled forward, grabbing the fallen Tvar's sidearm, snapping off 3 quick shots, each one precise, each one lethal. The last soldier staggered back, gripping a wound in its side, eyes wide in shock. This isn't possible. It whispered. You are one man. Elias pressed the barrel against its forehead. That's all it takes. The shot echoed. He moved before more could arrive, pushing through the remains of the city. The Accord's emergency beacon flickered on his HUD, final transport departing in 5 minutes. He forced himself to move faster. The ground trembled. A deep, unnatural hum filled the air. Then, a voice, cold, mechanical, amplified through 1,000 comms at once. Elias Vance. The High Marshal. You have fought well. Far beyond what any of us expected. You have taken from us. You have wounded us. But it ends here. Elias kept moving. Do you hear that? The silence? That is the Accord abandoning you. The ones you fought for. The ones you bled for. They have left you behind. The sky cracked open. The fleet was realigning. Not to continue the assault. No, this was something else. The Marshal continued. We could have crushed you long ago. But we wanted to see. We wanted to understand. And now we do. Elias ran. You humans are not warriors. You are something else entirely. You do not fight for victory. You fight because you refuse to die. The ground split apart. A drop pod, larger than any before, crashed down in front of him, molten metal hissing against the rubble. The door slammed open, and the High Marshal stepped forward. Armor black as the void. A frame that dwarfed even his largest warriors. The air around him hummed with energy, power thrumming in every movement. Elias exhaled. Finally! The Marshal tilted his head. No begging? No final words? Elias rolled his shoulders, testing his grip on his blade. Just one. He launched forward, blade flashing. Die. The Marshal was fast. Faster than anything that size should have been. Elias barely dodged the first strike, the sheer force of the impact shattering the ground where he had just stood. He pivoted, drove his knife into the joint of the armor, only for it to glance off, the material unbreakable. The Marshal backhanded him, sending him crashing through the remains of a transport. Pain lanced through his body, but he forced himself up, ignoring the taste of blood in his mouth. You are spent, the Marshal said. Your body is breaking. Elias grinned, spitting blood. You should see the other guys. The Marshal moved again. This time, Elias was ready. He dodged low, rolling beneath the swing, coming up with his stolen rifle. He fired point-blank into the Marshal's visor. The shots didn't penetrate, but they staggered him, enough. Elias lunged, switching grips, driving his blade into the small gap beneath the armor plates at the Marshal's ribs. The Marshal snarled, grabbing him by the throat, lifting him off the ground. Elias tightened his grip on the blade and twisted. The Marshal roared in pain, dropping him, staggering back. You insignificant! Elias didn't let him recover. He was on him again, slamming a knee into the wound, ripping the knife free and slashing across the exposed joint. Blood, black and thick, splattered the rubble. The Marshal swung wildly, but now he was slower, his stance faltering. Elias pressed the advantage. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was an execution. The High Marshal realized it too late. Elias ducked under the final swing, stepped in, and drove his blade up into the base of the Marshal's skull. The body shuddered. The energy field around it flickered. The great warlord, undefeated across 100 campaigns, fell to his knees. Elias leaned in, voice a whisper. That's fear. Then he ripped the blade free. The High Marshal collapsed. Silence. The Tvar columns erupted in chaos. Orders clashing. Fleets recalibrating. Their leader was dead. Elias looked up. The final extraction shuttle was taking off. He was too far. He had missed it. He exhaled slowly, letting the exhaustion settle in. He had done what he came to do. Then his calm crackled. Hold on. A ship broke from the clouds, not a cord. A stolen Tvar craft, piloted by survivors, humans who had refused to die. Elias smirked. Took you long enough. The ship landed hard, the ramp dropping open. Elias ran, ignoring the pain, ignoring the weight of everything behind him. He leapt onto the ramp as the ship lifted, gunfire trailing behind them. He collapsed against the bulkhead, breathing hard. The pilot turned. We got out. But what now? Elias stared out at the burning planet below. The Accord was gone. The Tvar were wounded, but they wouldn't stop. This war wasn't over. He gripped his blade, flexed his fingers, and smiled. Now? We teach the universe what fear really means.